I'm Peter Henderson, and this is the Case Against Celtic Boys Club podcast.
The founder of Celtic Boys Club has been found guilty of sexual offences against 3 boys in the 1980s and 1990s.
What the case comes down to is whether or not Celtic Football Club are responsible in law for the terrible acts of the paedophiles at the heart of Celtic Boys Club.
One by one, he raped them. He raped them systematically.
A child has got no chance of getting away from the child abuser. The fear and the terror is off the scale.
We were all young boys, at 14, 15, so nobody was going to really say anything because would they have been believed?
Just a warning, this podcast will not be gratuitous, but it will discuss the sexual abuse of children and its consequences. The biggest thing you can do to support the podcast is to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. The more members of the public that know about this podcast means the more people getting the survivor's message out there. The podcast is free, but it does take a lot of time and effort to make. If you're able to make a small donation to its production, it goes a long way to help. Please follow the link to our Patreon donation site. It's your help that makes this podcast possible. Welcome to episode 2 of the Case Against Celtic Boys Club podcast. In this episode, we'll hear from one of Scotland's best-known lawyers, Patrick McGuire. Patrick and I have been friends for many years, but for the last 6 years, we've worked together on this case. In this episode, Patrick tells me how he became involved, how the case is progressing, and just how the world-famous Celtic Football Club have behaved when dealing with the consequences of a paedophile ring operating at the boys' club for 30 years. On a rainy afternoon, a few days ago, he invited me over to his house to chat about the case.
Hi Peter, how you doing?
Hi Pat, how are you doing?
Hi,
Good to see you. Good to see you. Come on.
The thing about Celtic Football Club is that they set themselves out to the rest of the world as a club apart, something entirely different from every other football club in the world, because they were founded for charitable purposes for that very reason. That the football in many ways was an aside to the bigger role that it served in society in Scotland at that time, and that fame has led to them having fans all around the world. That they are a club that has had great footballing success, including being the first team in the UK to win the European Football Cup, done with an entirely homegrown talent from people within a few miles of Glasgow, where it is based. So they're a very famous club, they're a very big club, but they set themselves out, as I said, that the football is secondary to the charity, to the good works. And of course, what we've discovered with this tragedy involving child abuse that's been at the heart of Celtic Boys Club is that nothing could really be further from the truth.
So you mentioned the boys' club there, and the podcast is called The Case Against Celtic Boys Club. Can you explain what is the boys' club? What is Celtic Boys Club?
Celtic Football Club, like all football clubs, require a pipeline of talent to come through and to take on the main roles within the first team. And there's many ways that football clubs do that. Nowadays, it's all done through a network of youth teams that the club itself controls. What Celtic did from the 1960s right through until the 1990s was, rather than doing it themselves directly, as other clubs did, they relied on an organisation called Celtic Boys Club to do that for them, singularly and solely, to the extent that we have evidence that shows that Celtic football scout coaches would go around the country, find the best young talent and direct them toward Celtic Boys Club, who would be the de facto youth arm of Celtic Football Club for that length of time. And that's what this case is about, is the extent to which Celtic Football Club were responsible for the terrible deeds that went on at Celtic Boys Club.
Now, on those terrible deeds, your firm deal with a lot of child abuse cases on a large scale. Can you talk about the level of the abuse of children at Celtic Boys Club, the length of time it went on, the amount of perpetrators, the scale of it?
The scale of paedophilia, call it what it is, and do not shy away from talking about the ugly face of what went on at Celtic Boys Club from the 1960s all the way through to the 1990s, was on a scale that I have not seen in any other setting, whether that is in relation to sport or private schools or anywhere else, that a paedophile ring operated at the heart of Celtic Boys Club for more than 30 years. And children who were entrusted to that organisation were abused year after year, decade after decade, broken child after broken child. It's an absolute scandal that's at the heart of Scottish football and certainly at the heart of Celtic Football Club.
Can we talk a little bit about the perpetrators here now? You talked about the length of time, the amount of children that were abused. So, we're talking about more than one abuser here, aren't we?
Celtic Boys Club was set up by a paedophile who abused children in plain sight, and successive coaches of that organisation were also paedophiles. There's at least 5 well-known abusers who worked at very high levels at Celtic Boys Club who over that period of time abused children.
Let's talk about the involvement of your law firm, Thompsons. You're involved in a lot of historic child abuse cases. It's one of the main things that the firm does now. But that wasn't always the case. So what happened that meant that a law firm that specialises in health and safety, industrial illness, how did Thompsons and you, as a senior lawyer at Thompsons, become involved?
Thompsons have always been a firm that stands up for those without a voice. Traditionally, we were a firm that did that in the setting of personal injury claims, and particularly in an industrial setting, standing up for workers. We were approached because of our reputation for not being afraid to take on a difficult case, not being afraid to take on a big and powerful client to assist survivors of historic abuse. And at a very early stage, when we began speaking to those survivors, we were approached by survivors of abuse at Celtic Boys Club. And of course, Celtic are a huge institution in Scotland, and many people would be scared to take them on, to stand up against them, and to fight the good fight on behalf of the survivors of abuse that took place at Celtic Boys Club. And as we know, an organisation that were the de facto and in reality supply pipeline youth football set up for Celtic Football Club. But we certainly didn't shrink from the challenge. We had no hesitation in doing the right thing and standing up with and standing for those survivors. We've currently raised a group proceedings in the Scottish Court on behalf of those survivors, and we will see that through, and we have every confidence that we've got a strong case that we will succeed in.
Why now? Because, as you've mentioned previously, this has been going on a long time. Why is it only now that survivors have been able to come to a law firm like Thompsons? What changed?
I think 2 main things changed. Firstly, there's been a change in society. We all have read the newspapers, and we just recognise that for the last 5 years or so, survivors of historic abuse in many settings across the whole of the UK have finally felt able and empowered to come forward, to speak their truth and to seek redress. That's across the country, that's across so many settings. That's the first thing. The second thing in Scotland is that the Scottish Parliament, on an entirely cross-party basis, I have to say, and it's credit to the entire Parliament for doing that, 100% vote in favour of this change. The Scottish Parliament recognised that there is a real problem at that time with survivors of historic abuse being able to seek redress, because the laws of time bar in this country say that Normally, a victim of any type of wrong has only 3 years from the date of that wrong ceasing to be able to raise court proceedings. And if they don't do so, their case is time barred. The Scottish Parliament, as I said, on an entirely cross-party basis, recognise that just simply doesn't fit with survivors of historic abuse. They said that that time bar provision is wrong, and that time bar provision needs to be changed specifically for survivors of historic abuse. And now, thanks to an Act of Parliament, survivors of historic abuse are not subject to the rules of time bar, that 3-year rule. The defender in the case can establish that by the case being brought many years after the abuse ending, they are unable to be subject to a fair trial, that they will be unfairly prejudiced by the case being brought many years later. And that's what the law now says. And that change in the law empowered and enabled many survivors to come forward. And we are acting on behalf of many survivors of historic abuse for that reason.
So in terms of the civil case, what is the central point of the civil case? Because your case is against Celtic Football Club for the abuse that was committed at the boys' club. So what is the central contention on the part of the survivors through yourselves?
What the case comes down to is whether or not Celtic Football Club are responsible in law for the abuse that took place at Celtic Boys Club. In legal terms, we describe this as vicarious responsibility. Are Celtic Football Club vicariously responsible for the terrible acts of the paedophiles at the heart of Celtic Boys Club? And so the key issue in the litigation is, what was the connection between Celtic Football Club and Celtic Boys Club? As a matter of fact, as a matter of law, were the two organisations separate, or were they, as we say, and we've got very clear evidence of this, were they inextricably linked financially, morally, and everybody knows that's the case, but most importantly, legally, are responsible for the abuse that took place at Celtic Boys Club.
There are also criminal cases involved here, involving the perpetrators. How significant are criminal, and it's a matter of fact that there have been criminal convictions. How do the criminal cases affect your civil case? Are they helpful?
The criminal convictions, of which there have been many over the last few years, help the case to an extent. But of course, I don't think anyone can deny that significant abuse of children took place at Celtic Boys Club. That's beyond any doubt whatsoever. So the criminal convictions help, but they're by no means the key issue in the case. The key issue is whether or not those perpetrators, those people who have been convicted of child abuse, those people who we know did abuse children, that whether or not their actions in the context of being part of Celtic Boys Club results in Celtic Football Club being responsible for that in law, and that Celtic Football Club paying financial redress and allowing those survivors to finally obtain financial justice for the wrongs that were committed.
You previously mentioned group litigation. I've also seen it referred to in the press as class action, which is an American term. Can you explain what the group litigation is and whether or not it empowers the survivors to have a stronger case against Celtic Football Club in a civil legal action?
There are special rules within the rules of court at the Court of Session, which is our highest court of first instance in Scotland, to allow victims of a mass wrong to come forward and to together bring one court case against the person or people or organisation that wronged them. They are called, in the court rules, group proceedings. And that is exactly what it suggests. It's a form that allows two or more people who have been injured or wronged by one or more people to bring their case together. And what that new set of rules and they've only been in place for a few years do is two things. Firstly, in the context of historic abuse, such as the Celtic Boys Club situation, is it allows survivors to stand together, to give each other mutual support, and to allow them to feel far less isolated than they would if they were bringing individual claims. That collective power has certainly encouraged survivors to stand up together, and it's been a very powerful tool to that end. The other thing that it does is it allows the court to break down the issues that are at the heart of a court case into, I might describe it as bite-sized pieces. Because what happens in a normal court case is a proof date is set and every issue relating to that court case is results in evidence being led before the court. Legal arguments are made and the court decides on an entire basis. Group proceedings are designed to do the complete opposite. That what the court does is say, right, let's break this down into what the key issues in this case are, and let's deal with it bit by bit, so that the court may decide that the first issue that's got to be determined is time bar. Is the case time barred or not? And if the claimants are successful, they then move on to the next part of the case. And that's tried in a bite-sized piece before we move on to stage after stage. And that allows the cases to be advanced in a far more efficient and an effective manner. And that's exactly what is happening in the context of the Celtic Boys Club case.
So as you know, a lot of people follow this case, a lot of the public are interested in this case. What is the next crucial date in the diary in the group litigation?
As I explained, the way group proceedings work is that the court will break down the case into small sections. And in relation to the case against Celtic Football Club, the first milestone, the first section that the court has determined has to be addressed in terms of evidence and legal argument, and for the court to decide is in relation to time bar. Now you may say, well, why is time bar an issue, given what I said earlier on about the change in the law in relation to time bar rules being removed in relation to historic abuse? It's because that piece of legislation does contain one get out for would-be defenders. The law says that time bar is not an issue in relation to historic abuse unless a defender firstly offers to prove and secondly proves with evidence that they are unable to get a fair trial because of the passage of time. And defenders have been successful in some cases in arguing that. It's particularly when the abuser has died and there was no evidence gathered at the time, there were no reports to the police. You can see in those circumstances that might make it difficult for a defender to be able to have a fair trial. Quite astonishingly to me, Celtic have decided to deploy that argument in relation to the case against them in respect to the abuse that took place at Celtic Boys Club. They say they can't get a fair trial, despite the fact there's been criminal conviction after criminal conviction, despite the fact there's been report to the police after report to the police, and despite the fact the main abusers, the main paedophiles, are still alive. It's astonishing to me that they have the barefaced audacity to deploy that argument, and yet they are. And that's a matter that goes to trial in October of this year.
We'll rejoin Patrick in just a minute, where he'll explain just what Celtic Football Club have been like to deal with over this case. Welcome back. Remember to support the podcast by following and subscribing wherever you're listening. You can also really help by making a small donation on our Patreon page. The link is in the show notes. Now let's get back to Patrick. Okay, you've said that the defenders, and I want to explain to people who are not acquainted with legal terminology, the defenders means, in this case, Celtic Football Club. Celtic Football Club. So you've talked about the audacity of Celtic Football Club, having dealt with large, powerful entities in the past opposing them. How have you found Celtic to deal with over this?
Celtic Football Club's approach to these claims from day one has, in my vast experience, and bear in mind that all I've ever done is personal injury and claimant work since 1997. I can say this, and it may sound like hyperbole. Trust me, it's not. They stand apart from every other defender, every other organisation I have ever pursued a claim against in terms of the way they have thumbed their nose to the survivors of abuse. And it's important to bear in mind the context here. That's what we're talking about, is people who were abused as children and who are merely seeking financial justice. And Celtic have played every trick in the book, have done everything in their power to obfuscate, to delay, to spin, trying to avoid at all cost their moral and we say legal responsibility to pay compensation to these survivors.
I'm sure Celtic will say, we've just put out a statement that says we have sympathy and so on, but we were separate entities. The Boys Club and Celtic were separate entities. Thompsons have spoken a lot to the press about this. Why have Thompsons and many of the survivors involved in this, why have they chosen to speak to the press?
When you are seeking financial justice on behalf of particularly survivors of historic abuse, and when you're faced with the response that we have faced from day one, from when that first claim was intimated on behalf of the first survivor, which is to say that they ignore, they obfuscate, they deny any link between them and Celtic Boys Club. Part of pursuing that claim, of course, is through the courts, and that's exactly what we're doing. But I make no apology for the fact that part of the strategy as well is to publicly shame that organisation, because they're an organisation that present themselves to the world as an institution that has charity and doing the right thing as much at the heart of what they do as what happens on the football field. And yet this is how they treat survivors of historic abuse. So yeah, I make no apology for the fact that we've engaged in a lot of media in order that Scottish civic society, and actually in many ways, most importantly, Celtic fans themselves, say to the club, what are you doing? It's time you did the right thing. You must meet these survivors' demands for financial justice. Because what I can tell you is this, I know many Celtic fans, lots of Celtic fans, and every single one of them privately have said to me, you're doing the right thing, the conduct of the club is a disgrace, and we hope and fully expect that one day they will do the right thing. So yes, media is part of that campaign, of course it is.
You've met many of the men who were then boys, who were abused at Celtic Boys Club. What, as a group of clients, what's your impressions of them? Brave men?
Every one of the clients that I represent, the men that I represent, are incredibly brave. They have all had their lives torn asunder to different degrees. That the impact of the abuse that they suffered as children at Celtic Boys Club continues to significantly impact upon their lives.
You've talked about your impressions of the level of the abuse that was going on at Celtic Boys Club. Obviously, Celtic are a very well-known football club. They're a big sporting institution, but they operate in a small country. But they do have a worldwide support. How should people think about this?
I think the context is this. Can you imagine if you had 30 former players of Manchester United, Barcelona, the LA Lakers, the New York Yankees? And let's be clear, there's far more survivors out there, I've no doubt about that. I'm clear that the 30 brave men who are part of this litigation are the tip of the iceberg. But can you imagine if 30 players and more brought a claim for historic child abuse against the types of sporting institutions that I've just mentioned? It would be earth-shattering. It would be all around the world. I've no doubt that what we're looking at here is the biggest and the most rotten form of child abuse in the entire history of sport.
We have approached Celtic Football Club to ask them for a comment. We've received no reply. So that's where things stand currently with the class action legal case, and of course we'll keep you updated with any developments. You'll hear them here first. In a moment we'll have a preview of episode 3, but please remember to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. It makes a huge difference. And if you're able to support this free podcast by making a small donation, please follow the Patreon link in the show notes. Now, coming up in episode 3.
Torbett asked me to go into the back of the shop, and when I turned to look at him, he put his left hand out and took the back of my neck and pushed my neck down. I gritted my teeth and I pursed my lips, and I just wasn't allowing it to happen. When he had concluded, I turned and I walked out the shop. I was absolutely terrified.